So we're going to jump in and get started because we know time is precious in education especially. So welcome officially to webinar 4 of our MTSS series. Today we're talking about evidence-based practices and data within the MTSS framework. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to do a quick little welcome and review of learning. Then we're going to talk about some key vocabulary, data use, and then we'll wrap things up for you. We just wanted to remind you that we are really happy that you were with us today. Like Lauren said, as some of you were logging on, we are in webinar format because we have quite a large crowd today. So we can't see you, but we know you can see us. Feel free to use the chat throughout the presentation, though. We really like the interaction and the engagement from all of you and hearing you, at least through the chat, since we can't hear you otherwise. You will get a follow-up email link tomorrow that will contain a folder with these slides, any handouts we might show you today, and a certificate of completion. Also, this webinar is being recorded right now, and it's going to be posted on our YouTube page. And there'll be a pop-up survey at the end as you log out today. If you could just take a couple of seconds and fill that out. It's very short. I think 4 questions or less. Lauren and I love your feedback. We love reading your comments, and we really do use it to tailor these webinar series to what you're looking for. If you haven't joined us before, we are from Demonstrated Success. So we're a small educational consulting company based out of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And we help schools with anything and everything. So you can see from the bullet list here, we do things with curriculum and instruction. We do stuff with leadership, climate and culture, SEL, MTSS, of course, which is why you're all here, effective PLCs and instructional practices with data. So this is webinar 4 of 5. We just have one more left coming up after some school vacations happen. I know Maine, you're going on vacation next week, and I think New Hampshire the week after. And Vermont, you are sort of split down the middle, I think. So, we're excited, but we're doing number 4 today. And then, like I said, we'll come back together after everyone's had a chance for some vacations. And we just wanted to remind you, we have an in-person workshop coming up in Vermont at the end of March. We hope you can join us. And then one very soon coming up in Biddeford, Maine on the UNE campus. We had a successful one last year at USM in Lewiston. And so we are coming back to see you. So we'd love if some of you would join us there. And you can register your team directly once you get the slides tomorrow, right from one of these flyers. So I'm Tammy Hilton. I have been with the company for about 1.5 years. And I have about 20 years of experience in public education. I started off as a high school, middle school classroom teacher, mostly around ELA and humanities. And then I became an instructional strategist and interventionist at a middle school. And then, did some building leadership work there as well. And then my colleague Lauren is on the line with us. I'll let Lauren tell you a little bit about herself.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Yes, Lauren Mercier, and I too came out of the public school in 2021, just same time as Tammy, really, a couple of months apart. And I have background in secondary education. So I was a high school Spanish teacher for a few years and then high school counselor. And then I moved into an administrative role and was a director of student affairs in a K-8. So in all of those roles, have always enjoyed supporting students socially and emotionally, and have developed a particular interest in multi-tiered system of support framework and wraparound services, as my bio says. So trying to see the whole child and all of that which impacts the whole child. So great to have you on the call, and I'm excited to get going.
Thanks, Lauren. So these are our objectives for today. Like I said, we're going to really try to clarify some key vocabulary when we talk about evidence-based practices, and then we're going to talk about data and how data can really inform the work and the implementation of MTSS in your buildings. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to jump in with our review of review of learning.
Great, thanks. So if you've been with us, you recognize this. If you're new to the webinar series today, welcome and not a problem. We'll make a few references to previous webinars, but it's always something that we try to catch you up on as we're talking about it. So we do really want you to feel like you can come away with the ideas that multi-tiered system of support implementation is doable, and it's doable in all schools. It is a personalized framework, so it really does meet the needs of your school and your learners, your teachers. It's adaptable to the resources, both material and personal, that you have already. It's feasible to go along with that in the sense that Tammy and I really don't feel like you have to purchase all that much to get this framework up and running and implemented successfully in your buildings. And we do know that MTSS as a framework is comprehensive. It supports students universally, and it supports students all the way up tier 2 and tier 3, right? And so it's comprehensive for student needs. MTSS is also comprehensive for educator needs, right? So we really are using this framework just as much to support the professional development and learning of our educators so that they can best support our students as well. So this is our definition. We really do feel like this framework is a school-wide framework, of course, that it really is designed to anticipate barriers to learning for students. And, we encourage folks to be creative and to systematically leverage school-wide resources to meet the needs of students, right? That whole child, which we have talked about quite a lot, right? Considering academic, social, and behavioral elements and different realms of the whole child, right? And really, we look at that, right, to ensure equitable access and success for all of our students. These are our components. So we are sort of looking at those different pieces that fall within a framework, right? The MTSS framework. So we were looking at curriculum and instruction, equitable curriculum and instruction. We're looking at professional development. We're considering all of our positive behavior measures, right? And again, we're looking at universal behavior measures all the way through tier 3 practices that support student behavior. We're considering teaching explicit social emotional learning skills to our students. Response to intervention is a component, it's a piece of the MTSS framework, right? And so we did talk a little bit about that in the introductory webinar, just in terms of, MTSS is not RTI, but RTI is a piece of MTSS, okay? Student and family involvement is foundational, as is taking different accountability measures, making sure that we're using our data to respond to student needs. And then again, community, school, and community collaboration and engagement. So not just the student and the family involvement, but seeing how we can reach beyond that and into our local communities for support as well. In terms of teaming, we talked a little bit about district leadership team is really an essential component, making sure that your district is on board with an MTSS framework, because we need our district to help us with that political support. We need our district to be able to prioritize funding for MTSS as it comes up, right? If it's a framework we're going to sustain, at some point we're going to be putting money into this because we have to, right? As we look at different curriculums over time and staffing over time, et cetera. So this team is really collaborating and coordinating and communicating, of course, with our building leadership team or our tier 1 team. And so Tammy and I use those two team titles interchangeably. Okay. So your tier 1 team can actually be your building leadership team. And that team, of course, is looking at that universal component, looking at programming for everybody in the building, looking at universal data to inform programming and to inform hiring and staffing and master schedule build, et cetera. So those two teams are working hand in hand. There's also a tier 2-3 team. Some schools, depending upon need, have these teams separated. We're going to just combine them into one team as we kind of talk through this, but essentially this team is ensuring tier 1 process fidelity. Okay. We want to make sure that programs are being used with fidelity at tier 1 before we are programs and supports, before we are requesting assistance for a student from the tier 2 or 3 team. Okay, we want to make sure that teachers are really employing universal strategies, tier 1 practices, before trying several of them before we refer a student to tier 2. This again is whole child work at tier 2, right? So it's social, emotional, behavioral, and academic. The tier 2 team will determine these supports, again, using our data, consulting with staff, and then coordinating as needed for school and community resources. So you may have a student who is pushing into tier 3, perhaps, that may need some outside mental health counseling. So that is something that might be considered at the tier 3 level, as an example. Stages of implementation, we're going to come back to this today. And we spent a lot of time in this last webinar 3 on these stages. So we have broken down implementing this framework into 4 stages: implementation and readiness, the readiness self-assessment, which we talked about a little bit last week, planning and goal setting, initial implementation, and then full implementation. We found that a lot of folks that come to these webinars are sort of flexing between stage 1 and stage 2, just kind of getting their bearings and trying to figure things out a little bit in terms of what implementation looks like and are folks ready. And a lot of our work, when we do our workshop, the 2-day component is around these 2 areas, right? The 1 and 2. That would be stages. And again, we're going to come back to stages in just a little bit. And this was the school readiness checklist that we came up with. And there are several different categories on here, like school culture, data use, tier 1 practices, staffing, budgeting. And so essentially, this is encouraging your tier 1 team and or your district team. You can do this collaboratively to go through and look at your level of readiness in these areas. And eventually you'll develop consensus, and you come to these areas of priority where you say, geez, we really need to focus in on tier 1 instruction, right? Tier 1 instruction is something that needs to be a top priority as we move forward in this process, or your data use, or your school culture, right? So this is just a tool for you to use to help you through this beginning stages of this process. I will say that the dialogue that comes out of this exercise is amazing. And teams that we work with really, really enjoy this piece of the work. All right, Tammy, you're up.
All right. Thanks, Lauren. Okay. So we're going to jump into some key vocabulary. So the 5 terms that are really the foundation of the topic for our webinar today are listed here. And we're going to be discussing each one of these more in depth throughout this first portion of the webinar. So with that being said, the first one we're going to talk about is evidence-based practices. So this is a term that is very widely used in education, right? It's like one of those terms that we all hear. But I think people sort of have formed their own definition or interpretation of it. When we say evidence-based practices, it really refers to any concept or strategy that is derived from or informed by objective evidence, right? So other terms people use with this are like evidence-based decisions, evidence-based instruction, evidence-based school improvement. These, what they're really saying is that researchers have studied the impact of something in a controlled setting. So that's what makes something evidence-based. On contrast, the term research-based, which is another term that we hear in education, means that that program or that framework or that strategy has not been researched in a controlled setting. They are practices that are developed based on research in the field, but they have not necessarily been tested in that setting. So that's kind of the difference between research-based and evidence-based practices. So we're talking about evidence-based practices, and one person who has done this a lot in the field is one I'm sure you've all heard of, John Hattie, educational researcher. He looked at a lot of evidence-based practices that impact student learning and outcomes. And so the list that you can see here in the graphic is from sort of his top ones. We'll notice that an important piece is right up at the top with formative assessment. that is data, and that is going to drive a lot of your decision making, especially at the tier 1 academic level. Something that goes along with that here that we can see where the arrow just appeared is feedback. So formative assessments, we know, really give teachers and educators a lot of feedback about learners. And we're going to talk about this idea of what feedback means right on this next slide. So feedback, in terms of the way Hattie is looking at it and the way we think of it in terms of evidence-based, is not a number, it's not a letter, it's not a grade. Feedback in this case really needs to be meaningful, it needs to be personalized, it needs to be specific information about a learning performance or a learning outcome. It's not just giving justification for a grade. It's really like positive reinforcement and constructive criticism that's really going to help students or staff. If you're a building leader and you're giving feedback to a staff member based on data from observations and things, you know, it's really helping the person receiving the feedback understand how to improve or expand their thinking. And so we have this quote here from Digital Promise, and I'll let you think about that a little bit, but it really just supports the fact that it needs to be relevant and timely, right? It needs to be very specific. It needs to be aligned with the direct learner in front of you, whether that is a staff member or a student. So remember, academics is not the only piece of data we collect when we talk about the whole child, and when we think about it in regards to the MTSS framework. So this here's another list from Hattie, but this one was looking at things that impact students' behaviors or social emotional learning. And we know that those sort of work in tandem with each other and all impact the other. That's why Lauren and I have a really hard time separating academics from behavior from social emotional when we talk about the whole child. Notice here that Hattie notes that teacher-student relationships are one of the biggest influencers on student achievement. And I know when Lauren does some work with schools around SEL, this is a piece that she really talks about and has some fabulous, you know, strategies and things with. But with this in mind, you know, this is why MTSS is such a vital framework for student success in school. And so we're going to dig into this one here when we think about that. So we were just talking about feedback. And yes, it provides academic success benefits, but it also builds those trusting relationships. And so one way a teacher can build relationships is through fostering that sense of community using SEL techniques. So these might be things like community meetings or allowing for student voice and autonomy whenever possible, or if you have restorative practices in your building, you know, those are just a few of the many that we could spend talking about in terms of supporting, you know, this sense of community and belonging. And so this quote that just appeared on your screen here is from Dr. DeLong Gray, who's a professor at North Carolina State College. And Dr. Gray studied the impact of learning environments on different student achievements and outcomes. And this comes from a fabulous article called "Why is it important for students to feel a sense of belonging at school?" And we've linked you to this resource here in the presentation at the end. It's not a very long article, but it's really impactful. And I highly recommend you taking some time to go through that. So where do we find some of these things, right? Like, where are we going to look? So if we're looking for evidence-based practices and reviews when it comes to SEL or behavior, we have CASEL. This is a big one. It's, you know, a nonprofit organization that's out there that's really focused on social emotional learning. What Works Clearinghouse is a great one. Their mission is to really provide scientific evidence and educational theories and practices. You have Visible Learning, which is powered by John Hattie, right, and his research into things. And so you have that there for all aspects of the child. You also have evidence for ESSA. So these meet evidence standards. The website was really created to help identify programs. It is free for anyone to use or to look at. And then Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development This one is, their mission is really to provide a comprehensive registry for scientifically proven interventions that will prevent or at least reduce antisocial behaviors and really promote a healthy course of youth development as kids like grow and mature into adulthood. So those are just some for that. And then when we think about academics, there's a ton, but we've listed some for you here, and these are all hyperlinked, so you could certainly go and explore any one of these further. But the Center for Instruction is for K-12, looks at, reading, math, science, special education, ELL, tons of things. The Evidence-Based Intervention Network comes out of Missouri. They look at early mathematics and evidence-based math assessments. So it's really more math focused with this one, if you were a math person out there. The National Center for Intensive Intervention is a great one. They also have sample lessons, instructional videos, things like that. The Promising Practices Network will look at early intervention in reading, and then it will also look at mathematical programs, behavior things, etc. So this one kind of fit all the all aspects. The Best Evidence Encyclopedia, this comes out of Johns Hopkins University. This is a great one for K-12. Achieve the Core is really focused on ELA and math and relates tools and resources to the Common Core. Ed Reports, I think you're probably all pretty familiar with that. And then the Florida Center for Reading Research, this one's really reading focused. So those are just some of the many that are out there, but these I think will be a great place for you to get started. All right, so next we're going to talk about Fidelity. So Fidelity is another one of those terms that we hear a lot in education, but everybody sort of has their own interpretation of it. So what this means for education, it's really thinking about how closely prescribed our procedures are and the degree to which educators are implementing and following these programs and assessments. We also want to make sure we're having fidelity to our curriculum, right? So thinking about, are we implementing instruction of our programs as they're intended? Do we have fidelity to a process, right? MTSS is a framework, but it's a process to get up and running. We have data processes, so our protocols being followed. Do we have norms and things like that we talked about with teams? Interventions, we want to have fidelity with those. Are we following them and doing them the way that they are intended? And then to our system as a whole, is our request for assistance framework the way that we want it to be? Are we adhering to our PLC systems, maybe? Things like that. And then the next one we want to talk about is progress monitoring. So progress monitoring should be frequent. It should be ongoing. It should be directed towards a specific goal. So this could be done through student achievement is one way that we progress monitor at MTSS. These are your things like entry and exit tickets, pre and post assessments, peer observation cycles, anything where you're looking at student achievement over time. You want to progress monitor your student behavior. So behavior charts, student self-reflections, behavior data, things like that. You want to progress monitor yourselves every now and then, thinking about the goals that you'll set as a team or as individual educators, go back to those. If you set SMART goals at the beginning of the year, this is a great time of year to go back and kind of check in. Where are you at with those? What's going on? If you're working on a team, it might be a self-assessment tool. It could be surveys. It could be new practices that you're trying, and you have to sort of figure out, are they working or not? And then we really recommend, like, when you start honing in and really revising or creating this framework within your building, to do look at those action planning templates that you will eventually develop and really assess, how are we doing towards our articulated goals, things like that. Then we have accountability, right? So again, it's accountability for All of these things you see listed here on the screen. We know that strong ability systems really create a clear explanation that schools are going to use to make progress. For people, it really is going to help focus your attention and resources on a full range of things. And so it's really clear on what success looks like, right? So when you think about it in terms of students, for example, how are you holding students accountable for their own learning? Do you have them participate in goal setting or self-reflections or goal revisions? Do you have them do student-led conferences, or do you utilize restorative practices? Conferring is another great way to foster student accountability, build those teacher relationships we talked about a few minutes ago, things like that. When we think about it in terms of teachers, are we holding our teachers accountable for high impact instructional practices? And how are we doing this? Are we doing this through instructional rounds, peer observations, PLCs? Something to keep in mind is that staff are accountable for all students, right? So you want to get rid of the mindset of, oh, these are my students, these are your students, and really shift it to, these are our students. So what are we going to do about our students in our school community? Team accountability, again, holding yourselves accountable as a team in regards to your mission, your vision, your purpose, things like that. And then your school. Do we have high standards for all of our students across a district? Are we looking at longitudinal data? Are we looking at historical data? Are we doing perception surveys? Things like that. And then the quote here is from Bob Proctor. He's another person out in the field. He's done a ton of educational books, and he's, participated in studies. He has educational podcasts, and he is really considered the world's foremost expert on the human mind. And so he relates that to education, and it's quite fascinating at times. So I wanted to put that out there for you. And then our last term that we're talking about with this is we think about moving into data, and Lauren's going to talk to us about that in just a second, is efficacy, right? And so when we think of efficacy, it's really about bringing that accountability we just mentioned to a mission of some sort, and really thinking about the meaning, measure, and impact on something. Then we have self-efficacy. That's really the belief that we as our personal selves play a key role in influencing an outcome. So it could be our student achievement outcome. It could be student motivation. It could be, how much we affect the working environment. And it's really driven by personality and growth mindset. And Hattie talks a lot about these things as well, as we can see here. And then collective efficacy. We can see in this chart that collective efficacy is, according to Hattie, one of the top influencers of student achievement. And so it's really about that shared belief. And we talked in the first webinar about setting the why and really having this collective efficacy, so that, your group can be stronger. And research actually demonstrates that schools where there's a high degree of collective efficacy among teachers also have a positive attitude towards professional development and instructional strategies, and all of these components that we're talking about in relation to MTSS. And so it will really help drive your thinking in terms of, like, is our school ready to embark on this? What are our desired results? What do each one of the stakeholders need for learning and for further development? So you've just had a ton of information thrown at you. So I want to pause here and just see if anyone has any questions or thoughts to share. Feel free to put stuff in the chat. Give you just a minute of wait time. Right. So if you do think of things, please put them in there and we'll address them either at the end of the next section or at the end of the webinar. But I want you to have all of those terms in mind as I turn it over to Lauren, who's going to talk about data and where this all fits in with, like, accountability and efficacy and fidelity and all of those terms we just talked about. So Lauren, you're up.
Okay, thanks. All right, so this next slide you see here is this MTSS data-driven cycle. And so we have shown this slide before in one of the introductory webinars, but I just want to talk a little bit about this because we want to discuss how the data cycle applies to examining specific data, right, by using this cycle. And when we do that, it helps us work through this process and helps us inform our work and set our goals. So we know that data takes different shapes and forms. And sometimes when we think about data, we think about data coming from summative assessments, but data can come from all facets of our work, right? Both through our formal collection, but also our informal collection that we may make every day, right? As we walk through hallways, as we do non-evaluative walkthroughs in classrooms, as we give a student an exit ticket, right? Those are just informal ways that we're collecting data. We're going to use data to support students who may be considered at risk, but also, gifted as well. And I think Tammy and I have really tried to communicate that, that is one of the stark differences, right, between RTI and MTSS, is that we're supporting all of our students, not just those who need intervention, right? And then in a multi-tiered system of support framework, data really comes from the voices of all of our staff and students, getting family voice in there and community voice. I mean, you can consider, administering some type of 360 survey where you're really, getting the voice and the feedback of all your stakeholders. Let's say you were interested in exploring school culture, for example, or student engagement. You could push out a 360 survey. That just means you've got all your stakeholders involved, and get some really valuable feedback from families and the community members as well. So this image here is the data cycle that we will also work through for the stages of MTSS implementation. So you see in the rectangles, right, you're going to work yourself through that data cycle. So we collect our data, we analyze it, we implement support, and then we evaluate the effectiveness of it. So the ovals are representative of the different stages of implementation. So the exploring and assessing readiness is really that phase of your data collection. As you move into the analyze and plan stage 2, we're just saying, what do we notice about our data? What is it telling us? Right? As you move to the next piece, we implement and we think about the problem or the area of focus that we have. And we're basically asking, what are we going to do about this problem or this area of focus? And what strategies or practices are we going to implement to support students based on the data collection, right? And then finally, we evaluate and reflect, of course, how are strategies and supports working, right? Are the strategies and supports working in full? Are they working in part? Is something still missing? Right. So we want to make sure that we're really taking that into consideration and honest with ourselves about how our supports are working. Right. So we can use this, you use your team time. So whether it's your MTSS tier 1 meetings for this whole school data or your PLC team, right? So that's that grade level team meeting just to look at data. Right. So you can use that meeting time to do this type of work in your cycle. So that would be important to make sure that you find the time for your teams to be meeting and prioritize, like an MTSS tier 1 team, they have many roles and responsibilities, one of which is going through universal data. It would behoove that team to schedule times during the month where they know they're going to be only looking at data, right? Because you can't do everything, you can't go through every one of your roles in a 50-minute meeting, right? But you can get a lot of good work in if you sort of have themes, right? Or you schedule times to work on certain aspects of the roles and responsibilities of the tier 1 team, data use being one of them. So making the time to do that, right? And of course, we need to make sure we're keeping in mind their regular meetings to conduct progress monitoring of students, right? And that is mostly at the tier 2 or 3 level, right? We need to be progress monitoring to make sure that the strategy or the support we're putting in place is the correct one and it's working, right? So again, it's also to emphasize, this cycle can also be applied to the implementation of the MTSS framework as a whole, right? So for example, the leadership team will come back to that readiness checklist that we gave you as they work through different aspects of implementation. On the readiness checklist, you assessed whether measures were fully in place, partially in place, or not in place at all. So coming back through this data cycle and working through that will help to see what gains you're making, right, as a team, and in terms of that implementation of the framework in your building. All right, so this is really going to just be used as a transition slide. These are the 4 stages, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these different stages and like important questions that you can ask and answer around data in each of the stages. So the first slide that you're going to see is data questions for stage 1 implementation. Okay. And so in terms of stage 1, which is exploration and readiness, in the academic questions, where does our academic focus need to begin? And so to answer this question, we can consider data sources that provide us with longitudinal data information, right? That might be your state assessment system and universal assessments, right? That might include whatever your state annual assessment is. It could be the NWEA, it could be STAR, right? Those are examples of data where you can pull that longitudinal data, right? You may have online reporting portals. So New Hampshire has Performance Plus. It's called Performance Plus, and it's an online reporting system. I'd actually love to hear what you have in Vermont or Maine if you have an online reporting system, where it really just houses this information, right, for schools. Schools may also use course grades and common local assessments to gather that longitudinal data as well. Okay. In terms of social emotional learning and behavior, where does our focus need to be, right? So examples of data resources for this type of information could be your office referrals. You could further break up office referrals to the minor behaviors that get referred, which really should probably be teacher managed, but you get them. So your minor behaviors versus those major behaviors. You could look at attendance to look at absenteeism, truancy, tardiness, right? Who's coming in at 10 o'clock? Why are they coming in at 10 o'clock? Classroom behaviors, right? So those kind of those lower level behaviors that still get tracked by teachers. And then classroom observations, right? Where we can focus on student agency and engagement and collaboration. And we could also take student perception data into account here too, as well, in terms of SEL and behavior. Demographics, how do the demographics of our school impact our needs, right? So to look at data in this area, schools can use, again, your student information system. That may be Power School. That's, a pretty popular one that I used in my schools, but Power School would be an example of a student information system. Sorry, I'm the SIS. I've got all the acronyms in my mind, guys. Sorry. We can collect feedback through focus groups, right? We could bring our parents in for a focus group. We could bring our students in for a focus group. So we also have, for the New Hampshire folks who may actually be on the call, and again, I would love to know if the education agencies in Maine and Vermont have something similar, but we have a database called iPlatform in New Hampshire, and that is actually it's a database that provides, it's sponsored by our Department of Ed, and it provides school and district data for all schools across the state. It's like essentially like a report card for each school or district. And it's really put out there in the spirit of transparency and accessibility so that the data is available for everyone in the state. But you can look at statewide test scores, you can look at suspension data, you can look at all kinds of funding data, right? IDEA data. So it's all put out there for access. And then in terms of funding, how do we currently allocate our resources, right? And what do we have available, right? And so to really work through this data, we would encourage you to access, your business manager in the district and or your title funds manager. some of our work with MTSS teams actually have included work with business managers, right? Because they really are part of this process in terms of if you're thinking about sustained implementation of the framework and needing, to have that lens of funding and budgeting. So that's very helpful. Some additional questions, program efficacy. Tammy just talked a ton about efficacy. What programs have the most or the least, have been the most or least effective, right, in improving student learning, right? So you'll need to disaggregate this data by program. And again, you can use your longitudinal data, your state and universal assessments, or again, you can come to common assessments. Culture, right? This is so important. How is our school poised for the challenge of change? That's just really important, right? And so again, we can come to our focus groups for this. We could consider that 360 survey that I mentioned a little while ago. So that includes your staff, and that's all staff, not just your professional teaching staff, but your paraprofessionals. That includes your office administrative staff. That includes your cafeteria staff. That includes your custodial staff, right? So it is like everybody is part of this process. It's not just your professional teaching staff, okay? And then tier 1 classroom practices, what best practices can we build in our classroom? What can we build on, right? And so we can gather this by creating a survey or a rubric focused on tier 1 practices, or you could gather, and the rubric, I was going to say, or rubric with look for. So your rubric would have, look for as a sort of like an observational tool that your administrators can use on a non-evaluative basis, or your tier 1 team members can also go through and do non-evaluative tier 1 classroom observations to gather data. Okay. And then professional development, what's been successful and what gaps do we have in teacher knowledge? Like what exists in terms of their gaps, right? And so this data can be gathered through observational rounds or post-observation conferences or surveys, right? So stage 2, as we're kind of moving through, we're going to talk about stage 2, and that is planning and goal setting. So along with cyclically looking at the data described in stage 1, in stage 2, we begin to ask the questions that will help determine and narrow our area of focus. And remember, we start small, right? We've identified an area in which we want to focus. We can't tackle SELB and academics at the same time. We really have to hone in. So first, we're going to consider what data we want to look at and decide the area of focus again. So is it academic, SELB, and where are we going to start? Is it with curriculum and instruction? Is it with professional development and teaching strategies? So we have to identify, that area of focus first. We have to consider what data we will use to show evidence of growth or that we've attained the goal, right? And so if we are starting with behavior, your data collection, again, might include your office referrals, your attendance records, your discipline notes even, right? So next, we need to consider if we have multiple measures of accountability where they're needed. So remember that we're trying to build a strong accountability system. So if we're focusing on improving behavior and the overall climate in our school, do we actually have measures of accountability from various stakeholders? And again, I come back to 360 work. You've got to bring in all of your stakeholders, right? We also need to ask ourselves if teams and educators know how to use data to create SMART goals to move the process along, right? So we'll spend a little bit of time discussing that in a minute. We also spent some time talking about goals and SMART goals earlier on in the webinar series, but it's really important to articulate your goals, have your methods to monitor these goals, right? And have measures that you're going to use to make sure that you're attaining that goal. Okay. It's really important that that is articulated as you start this process. So this final bullet, actually, we actually touched upon this when we talked about establishing protocols back in our second webinar. And this is really making sure that your stakeholders have access to the data they need, and also making sure that they know the skills needed to use the data effectively, right? And so they can read the data, they know where to find it, they can read it, they know how to interpret it, and they know how to use it, right? That's really, really important. So this is something that tier one leadership team really needs to come out front with in terms of making data accessible and teaching staff how to use the data. So in the third stage here, stage 3, one of the things we want to ask is, what progress are students making as we strengthen our tier 1 instruction, right? So to answer this, we could choose data from, again, instructional rounds, our observations, our teacher self-assessments might be very telling, universal data from students, formative data. Again, we go attendance data. So there's a lot we could use. Referral data, okay, student self-assessment data. And then, what progress are students making in the intervention that we have initiated? So when we're considering the progress students are making, we can use, again, observations. We can use the teacher self-assessment. Charting weekly dipsticks can be helpful. So looking at those small formative assessments, such as the reflections, or I mentioned earlier, an exit ticket, right? Or a short focused discussion even between a teacher and a student, right? That is a way that we can dipstick and say, where are we at right now? Okay. We can also use interim assessments or behavior plan data, for example, to see if interventions that we have initiated are working for students and they're making progress, right? And then what progress are we making in implementing our articulated system with Fidelity? So for this question, our data sources could include, a regular review of our strategic plan, or collection, and then, an examination of artifacts of evidence. So the strategic plan is really, really important, and that falls back in line with the SMART goal that I just talked about. So not only are your grade level teams creating the SMART goals, right, but your tier 1 team is creating the SMART goals based on your readiness assessment and the areas of priority in which you define to move forward. Right. And you may define tier 1 instruction as a top priority. So then for this instance, right, we're coming back to our strategic plan to see, what progress we're making implementing our systems with Fidelity. And then this final section, this full implementation, that's 4, once you have a good working cycle down with initial implementation and a small priority area, right? So let's say tier 1 instruction. And by the way, that's not small. Like I realize that's a lot of work, tier 1 instruction, but my point in saying that is I guess I should say narrow, right? A narrowed priority area. So tier 1's a lot if you're focusing on instruction, but it's not tier 1 and data and budgeting and culture. Right. So we're going to make it smaller in that sense. Right. So once you have that good working cycle down, you can layer in other areas and move to full implementation in the MTSS framework. Right. But, so that would be, we start with tier 1 instruction. Right. And so we're doing really well with that. And now we layer in school culture. Right. And that becomes the next thing that we're working on in terms of that MTSS implementation. Okay. But just like data, right, the MTSS framework always needs to be like a work in progress. So it's just like responsive teaching, right? So in order to meet the needs of all your learners and your staff and the greater community, we consistently need to be working through our data cycle, asking questions and layering in new goals, right? Sub goals to your main goal so that you can keep achieving and pushing this framework forward. Okay. This looks really similar to what I showed you as the first slide, right? And this is a data-driven dialogue, and we've talked very briefly about this. I'm not going to spend too long in each of the sections, but it looks familiar to the MTSS cycle. It's supposed to, right? We want them to look fairly similar so that you feel like you're working with the same type of, cycle, and it's not something different or new. This cycle helps us work through the 5 different phases of dialogue when we consider data. And this can be for any data, right? This could be your behavior data, your major and minor track data, your attendance data, anything, right? So it's a really good idea when you use this type of dialogue to have a facilitator to help move you through each of the different phases of work here. So this dialogue can really be used as a starting point to increase teachers or educators' awareness of potential areas of strength and improvement, and it helps us generate questions that lead to the examination of other data, right? So always thinking about multiple data points, okay? You can, again, use this protocol for local benchmarks and or longitudinal data that you're reviewing, okay? So in phase one, really briefly, prediction, right? You are going to articulate as the educator, what you're hoping to learn and expecting to see. So you're going to ask some questions and you're going to think about what your assumptions are, what you predict the data might show you, some of the questions that you have, and then, what do you hope to learn from the data? And that's that phase one. In phase two, we observe data. And we will make our observations about what we notice about the data, what surprises us about the data. And this process is done without assumptions. So we may have some starting assumptions in the first phase, but when we observe data, we don't want any assumptions. We don't want to make assumptions. We're not reaching conclusions yet or making any recommendations yet, okay? Teams are encouraged to make their observations really precisely and be quantitative, right? Exactly what the numbers are showing us, okay? So for an example of this, you might look at data initially and say, students did bad on whatever it might be. But to make this more precise and quantitative, you might say 20% of students did poorly on and whatever it is, right? So quantifying data often helps us reduce confusion, anxiety, frustration, whatever it may be when we look at something and we go, oh my gosh, that's bad, right? So we want to try to move away from that, okay? Stage three is interpret data and make inferences. So this step kind of is going beyond the obvious and it's looking for relationships or causal correlations, right? To make inferences related to student learning. So during this phase, we can support our teachers to use the data to generate possible explanations. We might need to ask some further questions. We find, data needed to clarify some of the questions that we have. So we might need to do a little bit more here. And, we're going to share, the educators are going to share what they can infer from the data, regarding the impact of the data on student learning. Okay. And then implications of practice, really this group will, during this phase, the group of teachers or educators that you're working with will seek to identify connections between what the data suggests is working, what needs to change, and then what's missing. Okay. So this is also the time to reflect and focus on practices to improve our student learning. So for example, when looking at the data in this phase, the group might ask, what issues have been raised about the school-wide and classroom practices? What is the first step to increase student success in this area? What are the next steps the group should take, right? And then is there other data or material that we need to look at here, right? And then phase 5 is the reflection. And so that final phase in this process, what did we learn for next time? How can we plan better in terms of this cycle? It's very important to reflect on, how you can improve your data analysis process, right? What went well, what improved, what new learning do you have? Things of that nature, reflective questions to ask your team. So that would be the data-driven dialogue. I won't spend too much time here. This is SMART goals. We have talked about this before, but once you've reviewed your data and you understand its implications for student learning and for your practice, you can begin to create SMART goals for your next steps. Okay. So, crafting a SMART goal is designed to help you identify if what you want to achieve is really realistic and if the timeline is realistic as well. So is it measurable? Is it realistic? You want to be concise when you do this work. Your language is important, right? And these goals are designed to help you succeed. And should be written, well enough, but also basic enough so that, you can follow that goal and you can achieve that goal. Shouldn't have too much in it, not too vague, right? We've got to make sure we kind of hone in and be specific so that we can actually accomplish it and feel really good. Sometimes we're going to need to make sub goals, right? Because we have to. If we've got tier 1 instruction as part of a goal, you may need to find some at some point add some sub goals into that work as well. And then I think this is our last slide here. This is an example of what a SMART goal planning document might look like. So you'll start by recording your current situation, and then you'll craft your SMART goal with your team and determine how to measure it. So for example, if you're looking at student behavior, you could use data on discipline referrals for your student information from your student information system. You might also look at the percentage of students using a check-in, check-out system. Like that could be a measurement point. So who's accessing that strategy, right? Or that practice, and developing self-awareness skills and, skills regarding their own behavior. And then you can create, action items and specific areas to monitor those action items so that you're achieving the goal. So you sort of set the stage, you set your goal, and then you craft action items with, methods to monitor each of these action items so that you can check them off and you can say, yes, we've done this. We're working toward our goal, right? All of our action items have timelines. And when we have an action item, we assign a responsibility to somebody. So whether that's, a teaching team, whether that's administrative team, a tier team, somebody has responsibility to help move that action item along. So that was a lot. There's a lot today. This was jam-packed with information. So I'm not sure if there's any questions, but you all stayed with us and actually we gained some. So thank you. Tammy's going to wrap it up.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Like Lauren said, thank you so much for sticking with us. I don't see any questions right now, but feel free to reach out to us anytime. We do want to thank you for joining us. We're having one more, the final piece of this webinar series will come up March 8th after you've all had a chance to relax. We have those in-person workshops coming up. A lot of what we talked about today with the readiness assessment, picking priorities, making the goals, doing the action planning, that's a lot of what we work on in these in-person workshops with you and your team. So we hope you can join us in Vermont and Maine. And please remember to complete the survey that will pop up as you exit this webinar today. Our contact information is on the next slide. And then we have 2 additional slides of resources all about evidence-based practices and data. So with that being said, Lauren and I wish you all a very restful and relaxing vacation and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in March.
Yes, March 8th. Bye-bye.